There are only two pre-World War II heavy machine guns still in active frontline service anywhere on the planet. One is the American M2 Browning. The other is a Soviet weapon that destroyed $1.5 billion worth of Libyan military equipment, was carried on bicycles through the Vietnamese jungle, and helped bring down the French Empire. And in between all of that, the Soviet Union watched this same weapon become the single most effective tool used against its own forces in Afghanistan. This is the DShK. It's nearly 90 years old. It's been in more wars than most countries, and nothing has truly replaced it. But to understand how a Soviet heavy machine gun ended up on the back of a Toyota in the Sahara, you have to go back to 1925. The Revolutionary Military Council of the Soviet Union sat down and came to a pretty straightforward conclusion. The USSR needed a heavy machine gun. They specified a caliber range between 12 and 20 millimeters, and the primary role they had in mind was anti-aircraft. Now they acknowledged the gun could do other things, but they were very clear about one point. No design decision should ever compromise its effectiveness against aircraft in favor of any other role. Aircraft first, everything else second. By 1929, during military maneuvers, Soviet planners identified a very specific gap. Low-flying aircraft operating under roughly 1,500 meters were a real threat, and nothing they had could deal with them effectively. So they needed a dedicated heavy anti-aircraft machine gun, and they needed it quickly. The task went to Vasily Degtyarev, one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished small arms designers. At the time, Degtyarev had essentially just finished overseeing the production rollout of his DP-27 light machine gun, a design that would go on to serve the Soviet military very successfully for decades. And the directive he got was basically, take what you know and scale it up. He worked fast, and by 1930 he had produced the DK. D for Degtyarev, K for heavy machine gun from the Russian. But the DK didn't perform well enough to be adopted, and this is where the Soviet system of arms development gets interesting. They periodically brought different designers and design bureaus together, sometimes competing, sometimes collaborating. In this case, another designer was brought in to fix what Degtyarev couldn't, and that was Georgy Shpagin. You might recognize that name. The SH in PPSH-41 submachine gun stands for Shpagin. He developed a belt feed mechanism that effectively clamped onto the top of the existing action Degtyarev had already designed. And this new feed system nearly doubled the rate of fire, bringing it up to approximately 600 rounds per minute, which was considered quite satisfactory for the anti-aircraft role. And the key thing was, the belt feed was reliable. It got rid of the clunky drum magazines, and ammunition could now just be stored in simple cans full of belted rounds, which massively simplified logistics and handling. In February 1939, the weapon was formally adopted as the DShK, now carrying the initials of both its creators, Degtyarev and Shpagin, along with the K for heavy machine gun, and it was designated the model of 1938. The nickname it got, Dushka, means darling or sweetheart in Russian, which just comes from DShK. Production began in 1939. First guns reached frontline troops in 1940. Now, the gun as adopted in 1938 is the original pattern, and this specific version is rare today. In the final days of World War II, the DShK underwent significant modifications, a completely new feed system, along with a number of other changes, and the revised weapon became the DShKM. It's this variant that became predominant in the post-war era and in global production going forward. So, before we go any further, we need to talk about where this whole 50 caliber machine gun concept actually comes from, because it doesn't start in Russia. It traces back to a single German decision in October 1917. They're facing British tanks on the Western Front, and Germany created the 13.2 by 92mm cartridge designed for fighting tanks and aircraft. Now, the machine gun they planned for it, which was basically a scaled-up Maxim, was going to take too long. So Mauser was contracted to build a stopgap rifle instead, which led to the Tank-Gewehr M1918, the world's first purpose-built anti-tank rifle. The Americans were already thinking along similar lines. John Moses Browning started redesigning his 3006 M1917 machine gun, while Winchester developed a scaled-up cartridge. And that work eventually produced the legendary M2 Browning 50 BMG. The Soviets completed the chain. Between 1930 and 1934, Soviet designers developed the 12.7 by 108mm cartridge, basically their answer to both the German 13.2 and the American 50 BMG. For comparison, the American 50 BMG used in the Browning M2 is 12.7 by 99, same bullet diameter, but the Soviet case is 9mm longer. The Soviet round is slightly more powerful, though not to a degree you'd meaningfully notice in practical terms. And despite the shared caliber, the two cartridges are completely non-interchangeable. The case heads are significantly different in dimension and design. There's this persistent piece of old lore floating around, suggesting that Soviet 12.7 ammo could be used in American 50 cal weapons, but not vice versa. Entirely false. Neither cartridge works in guns chambered for the other. And if you look at the timeline, the DShK's development closely parallels the M2 Browning's history. The difference is in how they framed the requirement. The Americans built their heavy machine gun program around dual threats, increasingly armored vehicles and aircraft. The Soviets put aircraft as the top priority. So, let's talk about how this thing actually works, and then jump straight into combat. The DShK is gas-operated with a flapper locking bolt. What that means in practice is you've got gas tapped from the barrel that drives the bolt carrier rearward, and the locking flaps cam out of engagement as it moves. It fires from an open bolt, so when the gun is cocked and ready, the bolt is held all the way to the rear. You pull the trigger, it releases, the bolt flies forward, strips a round off the belt, chambers it, and fires. Simple and effective. There are two ways to charge the DShK, and this is, from an engineering standpoint, a really practical bit of design. The primary method uses a charging handle located underneath the spade grips. Now, this handle is actually part of the gun's mount rather than the gun itself, but it's by far the easier way to charge the weapon because the operator can put their full body weight into the stroke. You pull it back to lock the bolt to the rear, run it forward, and the gun is ready to fire. But then there's also a secondary method for situations where the gun might be on a platform that lacks the primary handle. A small socket on the side of the receiver is sized to accept a piece of spent 50 cal Soviet brass, which locks into place and serves as a manual charging handle. And you're meant to use an empty case for this, not a live round. The gun has a bracket on its left side for mounting an ammunition can. It's got a spring-loaded button that locks the can into place. The can itself has two mounting bars that slide over this bracket, and once it's mounted and locked, the front tilts outward to create a smooth feed tray leading up into the gun. You can close the lid over the belted ammunition to keep debris out, with just a narrow opening left for the belt to feed through into the receiver. It's a tidy system. So, the cyclic rate is approximately 600 rounds per minute, which sounds great on paper, but in practical sustained fire, that drops dramatically to somewhere between 80 and 125 rounds per minute. And that's limited by belt length, plus barrel heating. With B-32 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, it can penetrate 20 millimeters of steel armor at 500 meters. Weight is where things get really interesting. The DShK, in its standard ground mount configuration, weighs 74 pounds for the gun alone, which is roughly comparable to the M2 at 84 pounds. Not a huge gap, but the full infantry portable configuration tells a very different story. The DShK on its Kalashnikov universal mount with removable wheels came in at a crushing 157 kilograms. That's 346 pounds. Compare that to the M2 on its M3 tripod at roughly 58 kilograms total, about 128 pounds. So, if your infantry is hauling this thing around, you're talking about nearly 3 times the weight of the American system, and that matters. The gun is fitted with a hardened armor plate shield, approximately 5 millimeters thick, roughly a quarter inch, designed to protect the gun and its crew, assessed as sufficient to stop standard .30 caliber rifle rounds. And the tripod's legs can be spread outward, and the entire assembly can be stood up to serve as a dedicated anti-aircraft mount, giving much greater elevation range for engaging aerial targets. Which makes sense, because that was the entire point from day one. Now, comparing the two guns in terms of design philosophy, because this is where the differences really matter. The M2 Browning evolved from 1918 prototypes through the water-cooled M1921 to the definitive M2 heavy barrel. It was recoil-operated, fired from a closed bolt, and was designed from the very beginning as a universal weapon. The common receiver could be configured 7 different ways for infantry tripods, vehicle pintles, aircraft wings, naval mounts. The Americans put it on everything. But for decades, the M2 had one notorious weakness, and anyone who's worked with one knows exactly what I'm about to say: headspace and timing. Every barrel change required stopping to reset headspace and timing manually. Get it wrong and you'd get a ruptured case, or worse, a round firing before the bolt fully locked, which is a potentially catastrophic event. The DShK, as a gas-operated open-bolt weapon, never had this problem. Its flapper-locking design kept the bolt-to-chamber relationship controlled without any manual adjustment. And that made the DShK significantly more forgiving for less trained operators and irregular forces, which, and this is important, turned out to be a crucial advantage given who would actually end up using this gun all over the world. The M2's headspace and timing problem wasn't